Ahlazar asks, what is a mater lectionis, or what are matres lectionis?
What is the matres lectionis?
Let's give the simple answer first. The phrase matres lectionis is employed in academic circles to refer to instances where certain consonants from the script of a Semitic language are employed in a way akin to vowels when writing certain words in that language. For example, there might be a word which begins with, a word which has an O sound or an U vocalization, and a wa is employed to signify that O or U vocalization. Alternatively, there might be a word with an E vocalization, which is to say a long I sound, like the vocalization in the English word feet or meat or tweet. And in those instances, a yod is employed to signify that E vocalization. The word mater lectionis means mother of the reading. The plural is matres lectionis. The relevant character is a quote-unquote mother insofar that she is your guide in the reading, removing some of the ambiguity regarding how the string of characters is to be vocalized. However, as was just touched on, this issue becomes a bit more complex when discussing it with proponents of Lashon Kodash. First and foremost, the concept is rooted in a premise which proponents of Lashon Kodash generally deny. That premise being that in ancient forms of Hebrew, including Biblical Hebrew, a consonant followed by a wa or yod can point to that first consonant being vocalized with an o, u, or e vocalization. Suppose we have a bet followed by a wa. Understanding this as a mater lectionis, it could be vocalized bo, or it could be vocalized bu. Or, if you have a bet followed by a yod, understanding this as a mater lectionis, it could be vocalized b. Proponents of Lashon Kodash may balk at the suggestion that this is the case with Biblical Hebrew. They may wish to reaffirm their position, declaring that bet wa is never bo or bu, rather it is simply bawa. And so too, they could assert that bet yod never results in b, rather it is simply and always ba ya. This brings us to a second related point. The academic understanding of the mater lectionis entails that the biblical text is awash in matres lectionis. If we were to reject all the matres lectionis in the Hebrew Bible, this would start to look like a polemic against the biblical text itself. I think that if proponents of Lashon Kodash saw the extent to which this would have an impact on the text, some of them would wind up denying many of the examples of the concept. Consider as an analogy the words Adam and Edom, or properly pronounced in English, Adam and Edom. The wa in Edom would be an example of a mater lectionis. However, one has to wonder, how comfortable would proponents of Lashon Kodash be with the idea that the proper spelling for the word Edom, which is to say the name of the nation of Edomites, is identical to the spelling of Adam? How comfortable would they be with that idea? Moreover still, this particular example has direct relevance to the Sicarii group, to Ahlazar's group, as they hold that in Acts 15:17, James read an incorrect reading of Amos 9:12. Part of the issue there is that our extant Hebrew reading of Amos 9:12 has a reference to Edom, while James was either using a text that read instead Adam, or he employed a translation like the Septuagint, which itself translated from a text which read Adam. While the spelling of Adam and Edom is not the only issue with the different readings of Amos 9:12, it is nonetheless a central one. If we were to adopt the position that the correct spelling of the word is without a wa, then that seems to potentially lean towards James' reading being more plausible. At this point, members of the Sicarii group might say that the wa in Edom is not a mater lectionis. Rather, they could say it's simply a wa. This even has relevance for names which incorporate a fraction of the tetragrammaton. For example, ancient Hebrew seals of Judahite kings have been found, like this one for King Ahaz. The seal includes the phrase Melech Yehuda, or King of Judah. Let's focus on the word for Judah in particular. What's interesting is the fact that it's spelled without a wa. However, it is spelled with a wa in Biblical Hebrew. That is to say, the word for Judah, Yehuda, is spelled with a wa in Biblical Hebrew, yet in this ancient Hebrew seal, it was spelled without a wa. It would seem, therefore, fair to conclude that the wa in Yehuda is among the examples of matres lectionis. That opens an interesting door, because if even the wa in a name incorporating part of the Tetragrammaton can be considered a mater lectionis, then that begs the question, what about the wa in the name for Joshua, Yehoshua? This is the name proponents of Lashon Kodash pronounce Yahawashi. And thus we are left to wonder, might the wa in Yahawashi be an example of a mater lectionis? At this point, a proponent of Lashon Kodash might object that that's not a mater lectionis. They might just wave their hand and say, that's just a wa. But that leaves us with a question. Within the paradigm of Lashon Kodash, how can we ever demonstrate an example of a mater lectionis in an ancient Hebrew text? Couldn't one always just wave their hand and declare, that's just a ya, or that's just a wa?
Or to put another way, it's within the paradigm of the concept of matres lectionis, it could be argued that the wa in Yehuda is a mater lectionis, and so too, therefore, it could be argued that the wa in Yehoshua is likewise a mater lectionis.
Proponents of Lashon Kodash bringing up matres lectionis is a very recent phenomenon that's only popped up in the last few years, maybe 3 or 4 years. Nonetheless, while I'm not including Ahlazar in this, it has been my experience that those few proponents of Lashon Kodash who do bring up the matres lectionis are more often than not confused as to what it refers to. For example, I'm showing a tweet on the screen. Now, full disclosure, to my knowledge, the person who wrote this tweet is not a member of Ahlazar's group. At least I don't think he is, or I don't have any evidence that he is. I don't know what he's a member of, but he is a proponent of Lashon Kodash, and he's also someone who seemed to conflate the matres lectionis with the later nikudot, the dots and dashes produced by the Masoretes. The reason why I showed these particular tweets is because they're the most recent examples of that confusion that I've encountered, but I've encountered it elsewhere before. Interestingly, on a video from last May on the Sicarii Public Enemies account titled Camp Basher Approaches Sicarii, a deacon in Ahlazar's own group gives the strong impression that he himself was uncertain on the distinction between matres lectionis and the much later nikudot that were developed by the Masoretes. Here, listen to this.
So, have you studied the Hebrew? Have you did any research on the Hebrew?
A little bit.
Okay, so when you look at the Tetragrammaton, or the characters that make up the Tetragrammaton, it's very simple, brother. There was no vowel points. That didn't come to the matres lectionis, or whatever it was called, that the Masoretes put into play. They put vowel points on the characters. So before that, it was just Yahweh.
Now, again, I'm not including Ahlazar in that, because in his review of Vocab Malone's interaction with GMS Dallas, he clearly stated that the matres lectionis come from well before the time of the Masoretes. Nonetheless, we see that a deacon in his group apparently was under the impression that the matres lectionis were the vowel points introduced by the Masoretes. And I don't show that as part of some attempt to ridicule or satirize anyone. Rather, I show it to demonstrate that there is a real need to clarify how people understand the subject. There are proponents of Lashon Kodash who will refer to the matres lectionis without quite understanding what they refer to. And it seems that some of those folks may even be within Ahlazar's own group. And so I think that in itself shows that there was real value in what I had said in my previous videos, in my attempts to start a discussion on how proponents of Lashon Kodash understand the matres lectionis.
Gentleman who goes by the screen name XUncleA123X left a comment saying that he had seen another video, which had argued that forms of Yehoshua, both without the wa in between the hey and shin, yet after the shin, as well as without any wa at all, appear in the Dead Sea Scrolls. He said he himself had not seen this, But he rightly noted that if that's true, it presents a case for the wa in Yehoshua and the standard spelling of Yehoshua being a mater lectionis. I appreciated his comment and responded as follows, quote, I personally have not yet found a text or inscription employing Yehoshua without any wa, but it would not surprise me, just as Yehuda without a wa did not surprise me. Moreover, I think the latter speaks to the plausibility of the former. I hope to look into it more when time permits. End quote. I wound up discussing this topic with a colleague who is a bit of a Semiticist in his own right, and he recommended I see the 17th century work Duo Tituli Thalmudici, Sanhedrin et Maccoth, which has been digitized and is available online. I didn't know this, I wasn't familiar with this work, but he pointed me in the right direction. The work is a 17th century bilingual corpus providing two tractates from the Babylonian Talmud side by side with a Latin translation. And my colleague informed me that variant spellings of the sort I was looking for the name Yehoshua, are found in that work. Now, subsequently, I later found out that the relevant spellings also appear in fragments from Qumran, which is to say from the Dead Sea Scrolls. And I understand that as some of my audience will have a visceral reaction to anything Talmudic, it might be better just to show those readings rather than get into this Talmudic work. But I appreciated what my colleague shared with me so much, I wanted to include it anyway. So here is page 321 of the relevant work, which shows Tractate Sanhedrin, page 93a. I'm going to scroll down to the relevant portion here and zoom in. I'll also highlight the relevant portions. So you'll see there's a few instances of Yehoshua, Kohen Gadol, but whatever the case, the main point is that you see the name Yehoshua, Joshua, spelled without any wa whatsoever. And by the way, in that last instance, which is starting from the third line from the bottom and then continuing on to the second line from the bottom, it's actually quoting the first verse of the third chapter of Zechariah. It says, Yehoshua HaKohen HaGadol Omed Lifnei Malach. Joshua, the high priest, is standing before the angel. Whatever the case, the salient point is the spelling of Yehoshua. Now, this isn't the spelling in all editions of the Talmud, but in this particular edition from the 17th century, which was probably using very old manuscripts, we see this spelling without any wa. Yehoshua is simply spelled Yod He Shin Ayin, and that's quite interesting because that seems to imply that the wa in the standard spelling of Yehoshua is essentially a mater lectionis, anticipating that certain folks will say, who cares about the Talmud, forget about the Talmud, it's a medieval text. So I turned to this very helpful text, very valuable text. It's the book, The Biblical Qumran Scrolls by Eugene Ulrich, published by Brill back in 2010. It's a very helpful work as it reproduces all the readings of biblical texts which have been found amongst the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran. And then I was able to use what's listed in the book to examine some of the fragments available online. What I have on the screen now is material from the Dead Sea Scrolls, specifically Cave 4 at Qumran, and specifically Numbers 27 in the material on the left. So I'm just going to zoom in here and we're going to show a portion of verse 22. So the top line begins with Et Yehoshua. Actually, it reads Et Yehoshua ben Nun. The Masoretic text doesn't include that part, ben Nun, son of Nun, but this text found at Qumran reads Et Yehoshua ben Nun with those two extra words. It's missing the verb Wayikah, and then the next three words after Et Yehoshua are Wayaqami Dehu Lifnei Ahlazar. So he took Joshua and established him, set him up before Ahlazar, Eliezer, as they say. But what's really relevant here is how they spell Yehoshua. So I want to zoom in on specifically that part. And what you see is that in this ancient text, this ancient copy of the book of Numbers, his name is spelled Yod He Shin Wa Ayin. And that allows us to do a comparison of the different spellings of the name which we've seen so far. So first note that in most of the Masoretic text, or most of our standard extant Hebrew Bible, the name of Joshua is spelled Yod-He Wa Shin Ayin. The Wa appears once and it's after the He. However, in that same text, in the Masoretic text, our standard Hebrew text, it's spelled differently in Deuteronomy 3:21 and Judges 2:7, where it's spelled Yod-He Wa Shin Wa Ayin, where the Wa appears twice, once after the He and then again after the Shin. However, then we saw a third spelling within the book of Numbers, as found in the Dead Sea Scrolls at Cave 4 at Qumran, where it's Yod-He Shin Wa Ayin, where only one Wa appears and it's after the Shin. So think about this. We have the standard spelling where the Wa appears after the He but not after the Shin. We have a less standard reading, which also appears in the Masoretic text, in a minority of the readings within the Masoretic text, where the Wa appears both after the He and after the Shin. And then we have an ancient witness to a spelling in which the Wa appears after the Shin, but not after the He. Now, if you can have a reading where the Wa does not appear after the Shin, as is the case with most readings in the Masoretic text, and you can have a reading where the Wa does not appear after the He, as is the case with the reading from the Dead Sea Scrolls that we just looked at, can you have a reading like the one we saw in the Talmud, which is at the bottom line of this image here, where the Wa does not appear after either the He or the Shin? That's an interesting question, isn't it? So these fragments are from the book of Joshua, also found at Qumran in Cave 4, and I'm going to zoom in on text corresponding to the 8th chapter and the 35th verse. Here we go. And so the portion at the top line reads, Asher lo qara Yehoshua neged kal, which is to say that which Joshua did not recite towards all. But what's most of interest to me is how the name Yehoshua is spelled. So let's zoom in on specifically that. And what we find is that the name is spelled Yod-He Shin Ayin, without any Wa. No Wa after the Shin and no Wa after the He. And and that's the reading which we saw appeared in that Talmudic text that we looked at, or at least that particular Talmudic manuscript from the 17th century. And what this tells us is that if one is going to embrace the academic or scholarly concept of matres lectionis, the Wa in the standard spelling of Yehoshua would have to be considered, would be a prime candidate for a mater lectionis. Of course, if one wishes to deny that, it's going to raise questions about how they understand the mater lectionis. So I just wanted to offer this as a quick bit of food for thought. I think it's relevant to discussions about the mater lectionis with certain cohorts. There are a few questions that I would have for proponents of Lashon Kodash who appeal to or mention the concept of matres lectionis. First among them is the question, how do proponents of Lashon Kodash understand the concept of matres lectionis? And I don't mean that in any sort of patronizing way. What I mean is that, for example, the concept of matres lectionis entails that centuries before the time of the Masoretes, even a millennium or more before the Masoretes introduced the vowel points, the nikudot, speakers and writers of Hebrew were already employing O and U and long E vocalizations in their writing of the Hebrew language. Do proponents of Lashon Kodash acknowledge that O and U and E vocalizations were part of the Hebrew language, were part of written Hebrew centuries before the time of the Masoretes, more than a millennium, perhaps, before the time of the Masoretes? A second related question, which came up in my previous videos on the subject, is how do proponents of Lashon Kodash determine when a mater lectionis is present? Now, that's a fairly easy question to answer outside of the paradigm of belief in Lashon Kodash, but within the Lashon Kodash paradigm, it's an interesting question. Now, to be clear, I'm not referring to cases, for example, where a Wa is being used as a conjunction or is being used to set up the third person plural on a perfect tense verb or anything like that. But in other cases, like in an active participle in the singular, or even in a word like lashawan,
Think about that. The first word in the phrase Lashawan Kodash, that word Lashawan, is the wa in Lashawan a mater lectionis? And how do you answer such a question? How do you determine whether it is or isn't? Via what standard? I'm not joking. I'm actually sincerely interested in how proponents of Lashawan Kodash would answer such a question. And finally, the third question I would ask is, do proponents of Lashawan Kodash see a mater lectionis as introducing a new vocalization, or merely as introducing a symbol representing an already existing vocalization? This is a nuanced question, but it's an important question. In my past videos, including videos responding to Sicarii, where I discuss the vocalizations in the Masoretic text and vocab's appeal to the cry on the cross in the New Testament, I noted that it's clear, the evidence is clear, that the Masoretes did not just introduce new vocalizations. Rather, the Nikudot symbolized vocalizations that had clearly existed for centuries, that had existed long before the time of the Masoretes. And the reason why it's important to point that out here is because we sort of get a rule of thumb that we can work with. Just because symbols representing vocalizations are introduced, that doesn't mean that those vocalizations came into existence at the same time as the symbols representing them. So just as the vocalizations implied by the dots and dashes in the Masoretic text could predate those symbols by centuries, so too the introduction of matres lectionis, the introduction of matres lectionis, assuming there is a beginning point for them within specifically the Hebrew language. Believe it or not, there's people that actually dispute that, even though we can easily point to other Canaanite dialects that don't use them. But nonetheless, the point that I'm trying to make is that the introduction of matres lectionis into a writing system would not necessarily entail the introduction of the vocalizations that they represent. Those vocalizations could have existed long before the matres lectionis were introduced to represent them. The point here is that the topic of mater lectionis is not a simple one within the paradigm of an assumption of Lashawan Kodash. Therefore, if we are to have a serious discussion on the parameters of matres lectionis with proponents of Lashawan Kodash, we may need the particular proponent with whom we are conversing or corresponding to clarify how they understand the concept.